at the core, their credo, the I believe part of science, modern science, is that there is and can only be matter and energy, and that everything can or will be explained by interactions between matter and energy. So they are convinced that the beginning of creation will eventually be explained by interactions between matter and energy, and that consciousness will be explained as a product of matter and energy, and that the origin of life will be explained as life arising from interactions between matter and energy. And these are core beliefs of modern science. For those of you who have a good understanding of spiritual teachings, especially universal spiritual teachings, you might already begin to see that what M theory is describing as an ocean of energy out of which all creation springs sounds a lot like the astral regions or the spirit regions or the heavens. And without meaning to, I'm sure, M theory actually gave us a location for the afterlife. Gave us a location.
Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Puedu, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We do this through online presentations and interviews with guest speakers, as well as classes and study groups, and we draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading-edge studies in science, consciousness, spirituality, and philosophy. We are in our 20th year, hard to believe, but we are. We started in 2003. However, we started recording our guest events in 2020. So I was just telling Joseph, this is our 99th presentation that we're recording. So our video recordings are viewable through our website. There's lots there that you may not have seen. The website is caritascenter.org, and also on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep us going. So if you enjoy our presentations and would like to support our program, please make a donation or become a member by going to our website, and you can enjoy the benefits of membership. And now let me introduce our speaker tonight, who is Joseph Selbie. And he enjoys making the complex and obscure simple and clear. He is the author of Breakthrough the Limits of the Brain, this book here. Oh, no, that's not the right one. Sorry. Breakthrough the Limits of the Brain, and also The Physics of God, which is the one that we're going to be focusing on tonight. And if you missed the last presentation with Joseph Selbie, you can find it on our website or YouTube channel. He also has a book called The Yugas, which I have not yet read, but I'm looking forward to doing that. It is a topic that I'm very interested in. He's known for creating bridges of understanding between the modern evidence-based discoveries of science and the timeless experience-based discoveries of the mystics. A dedicated Kriya yoga meditator for nearly 50 years, he has taught yoga, meditation, and universal experiential spirituality through the US and Europe. His role as teacher and minister and decades of study under Swami Kriyananda, Ananda's founder and director and direct disciple of Yogananda, gave him a deep dive into Eastern philosophy, meditation, and comparative religion. Joseph appears with Elizabeth Rome in the 2014 Ananda docu-drama Finding Happiness, which showcases Ananda Village, one of the most successful spiritual communities in the world. From a family of scientists and engineers, Joseph is a critical thinker, grounded in fact-based approaches to discovery. He's studied physics, chemistry, and microbiology at the University of Colorado. His presentations, classes, articles, and books have always blended science and spirituality. And now retired, Joseph was a founder and the CEO of TriStream, maybe, an early pioneer in experience design for the web. He collaborated with Jacob Nielsen, a thought leader in experience design, to write best team practices for web application design, and spoke at many Nielsen Norman Group conferences in the United States and Europe. TriStream clients included Cisco, Logitech, Ariba, SAP, Manpower, Tektronix, and Wells Fargo. His website is www.josephselbie.com. Welcome, Joseph, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
My pleasure. Glad to be here again.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. We have a lot to talk about because there is so much in this book, The Physics of God. So let's start with my getting my notes in front of me. Hold on one sec. Here we are. Let's start with, since God is in the title, let's begin with a few definitions, including what do you mean by God? It's such a difficult word in many respects because everyone has their own ideas. So let's get your.
As you say, I think everybody has many, many different ideas about God, and in part because God is not one simple thing above all. God is a creator. And in the teachings as I understand them, spiritual teachings as I understand them, God sustains creation, that creation doesn't exist without the continuous presence of the energy and intelligence that makes creation exist. And yet God exists beyond creation. And God is knowable because we are souls made in his image, made in God's image, and that we share all of the properties, all of the qualities of God are inherent in us. So we're one with God. God is one with us. God is infinite, so we are infinite. God exists beyond creation, so we exist beyond creation. And when we experience God, which is the most important thing, we experience God as joy. Paramahansa Yogananda defined God, its most simple definition, as ever new joy. That when you experience God directly, you feel that sense of ever new, ever filling, ever satisfying joy, filling your heart, filling your mind, and that is perhaps the most important way to understand what God is, because it's experiential rather than just intellectual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't tend to personify God. When you say we're made in God's image, what do you mean? Does that mean God looks like us?
It's a great question, because that's usually the way that saying from the Christian Bible is interpreted. If man is made in God's image, then God must be a person. God must be an individual being with its own body. But actually the opposite is meant, is that the image of God in which we are made is formless and infinite. And that is the true image of God. That is the true nature of God. And we partake of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So your subtitle in this edition that I got, it says how the deepest theories of science explain religion and how the deepest truths of religion explain science. So I tend to think of religion as an institution where we're dependent on a creed or some kind of clergy or human authority for understanding spiritual truths, and spirituality as a more direct experience of transcendent realities revealing spiritual truths, or at least a more personal effort towards that direct experience. Would you explain what you mean by religion, and do you differentiate it from spirituality?
Well, I do and I don't differentiate it from spirituality. I sort of redefine it in a sense as spirituality, but not just simply saying they equate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think that all religion has as its fountainhead of experience, its fountainhead of inspiration, direct experience of God. And that all of the world's major religions, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity, all were inspired by founders, saviors, visionaries that directly perceived their oneness with God, that there was no separation. And then it's only over time that their core teachings began to become more dogmatic, not because they were dogmatic or they were exclusive, but because the followers who came along later, many generations later in some cases, were drawn to making that expression of the universal truths of spirituality a unique and exclusive path. So Christians wanted Christianity to be the only path, and Buddhists tend to also follow that, although they are more universal. But the Hindus tend to be very, very sectarian in that regard as well. But that came along later. Paramahansa Yogananda said, meaning it to be amusing, that Christ was crucified once, but his teachings have been crucified every day since then. That the misinterpretations of what was meant, and then misinterpretations built on misinterpretations over time, brought us to kind of our present estate as far as how religions operate and how people perceive religions.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I think there's a clear distinction between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is more about direct personal experience. But I think it's important to realize that religion strayed from that core truth of spirituality, of direct perception of the divine. And it didn't begin as an organizational thing or as a collection of dogmas and tenets, but it really, its lifeblood is direct experience. And if you look at the history of religions, you will see that they're periodically sort of refreshed by saints and by sages who kind of bring people back to what the core purpose and true meaning of the teachings are. And so you get a Saint Francis who is probably revered worldwide for his simple, direct, loving experience of Christ and of God and of his fellow men. And it's easy to see how important that was at the time, because Christianity had fallen into very dubious practices, among others, selling dispensations. So you could become a saint.
Right. You could go to
If you
heaven
could afford
finding a
it,
way to heaven.
you could get all this built-up grace of the church. They could sell it to you. So that it just got into bizarre and understandably human misdirections. But saints come along to refresh it. And I think this is true of every religion in the world, and every religious tradition in the world needs to be refreshed with direct experience. So yes, they're separate, but yes, they're also very much connected.
Mhm. Okay, let's shift over to science. Could you talk a little bit about scientific materialism and its influence today?
You mean the number one religion in the world?
Yeah.
Science?
Right. Yeah.
And
Scientism.
it truly is a religion, because it
Yeah.
it is built on a belief system. Now, if a hardcore scientist were to be in the same room with me when I said that, he would probably shout at me and say, no, you obviously don't understand science, because science is based on facts and everything else is not based on facts, and that everything we arrive at is through this scientific method of experimentation and verification and being able to repeat experiments and get the same outcome, and that it's fundamentally different than religion. And in some ways that's true, but in some ways it's not true, because what religion has fallen into, I think science has fallen into without kind of understanding even that they fell into it, is that at the core, their credo, the I believe part of science, modern science, is that there is and can only be matter and energy, and that everything can or will be explained by interactions between matter and energy. So they are convinced that the beginning of creation will eventually be explained by interactions between matter and energy, and that consciousness will be explained as a product of matter and energy, and that the origin of life will be explained as life arising from interactions between matter and energy. And these are core beliefs of modern science. And it's widely accepted. The central credo of modern science is believed, I would just guess, by 3 or 4 billion people living on the planet, if not more. And you'll see this manifested, you'll see this belief come forward when someone like myself steps forward and says, consciousness exists outside the brain. And you're almost bound to be attacked by serious scientific materialists, because they say, that's not possible. There isn't anything other than matter and energy. And therefore, unless you can give me an explanation for how consciousness arises from matter and energy, your hypothesis is just fundamentally flawed. And if you're in the world of science and you try to make a case that consciousness exists as an independent reality from matter and energy, you'll have a very short career, or you'll have a very fireworks-like career that is then ends soon, because it is a basic tenet of this belief system. You will find that good, solid research that proves consciousness exists independently from matter or energy is ignored by the scientific mainstream.
Well,
And
that's
yet
the irony.
there are hundreds of experiments that have been conducted in scrupulously, rigorously exact scientific ways that are just ignored. One of my favorite ones that is ignored is a experiment that, forget which scientist did it first. Sorry about that, but
Is this the double slit?
no, and I will get to that one too, because that's fascinating. But this is another one where two test subjects meditated together, and they weren't told what the experiment was going to be about. They only asked the subjects to be open to the possibility that meditating together had connected them in some way. And it was just left very vague. And then after they meditated for 15 or 20 minutes together, they were taken into separate rooms in a facility, and they were put into Faraday cages. Some of you might know what a Faraday cage is, but essentially it's a small area, typically, that is covered with copper mesh and wire mesh, which effectively eliminates any ability to get electromagnetic frequencies inside the cage. So it's like isolating that person from any kind of electromagnetic influence. Then both subjects are hooked up to identical electroencephalographs, similar to what is used in a lie detector apparatus.
They're each in their own Faraday cage.
They're each in their own cage, and they're each hooked up to identical machines.
Mhm.
And then one of them has a bright light shined in his eyes. And when you look on the record of the EEG, you'll see a big spike of brain activity in response to that bright light being shined in his or her eyes. No surprise there. But the other person in the other Faraday cage, also hooked up to an EEG, over 50% of the time, their EEG registered a spike as well.
Because they
couldn't see each other, they couldn't hear each other. The one who was not being stimulated had no idea how the other was being stimulated. They had nothing to go on, nothing to guess at, nothing to, sort of psychosomatically create a response. And yet, with a very high level of correlation, every time the first person had the light shown in their eyes, the second person's EEG would register the same kind of event. So this is one of, as I say, hundreds of experiments that just kind of get ignored because they don't fit this belief system that matter and energy are the only things that exist.
So do you think that the fact that they had them meditate together brought them into, I don't know if this would be the right term, but like closer entanglement? Because
they did something, because they did a control group of people who didn't meditate together, and there was no correlation.
No correlation. Because I've read of other experiments where someone is asleep in a room, and then the subject is in a different room watching a movie or video of some kind, and then the person who's asleep reports, when they wake up, dreaming about
whatever the movie was.
Yeah.
There are literally hundreds of these experiments, and they're all by scientific materialists considered to be obviously flawed experiments.
No matter how rigorously.
They couldn't be valid because that's impossible.
Right,
But
right.
within even the aspects of science that has a great deal of acceptance, notably in physics,
Mhm.
there's this gaping hole in the notion of scientific materialism. There's this big hole in the notion that energy and matter are the only things that exist. And this hole is referred to often as the observer effect or the intelligent observer effect. It is fascinating. So I'm going to, because we have a nice long window I can talk to you in,
Yes, yes.
I'm going to walk you through this experiment as best I can, because it is kind of mind-bending when you get to the end of it. So there is an experiment that you've probably heard of known as the double slit experiment. And the double slit experiment has lots of applications, but one of them is that it's used to reveal the intelligent observer effect. So the basic setup of the double slit is that you have an apparatus set up. You can imagine it as a closed box, if you will. And that one side of that closed box has two vertical slits that are relatively close together. It can vary a lot how close they are, but the key is that they both allow light to come in to the box, and on the opposite side of this box, there is a detector, and the detector can immediately detect where light is hitting it and the degree or the intensity of that light. So this apparatus was set up originally to test whether light behaved like a wave, and they determined that light does behave like a wave because when the light that was shown through the slits into this closed box made its way to the detector on the other side of the box, it would move in a wave-like fashion. And like water waves that run into each other on the surface of a pond, some of the waves would be amplified, either higher peaks or deeper troughs. Some of the waves would cancel each other out. And this is exactly the way water behaves on the surface of a pond. And so you could see clearly that light behaved in a wave-like way because the the gradual buildup of detecting this light hitting the detector showed what's called an interference pattern, was banded. So you'd have bright bands alternating with dark bands. And the bright bands were where either a exaggerated trough struck the detector or an exaggerated peak struck the detector. And the dark bands were where the two waves canceled each other out. So hopefully you're all with me on this, that light can behave like a wave. You can think of it as water waves interacting with each other and how they cancel out the waves that are produced, or they amplify the waves that are produced, depending on where they intersect. Well, other scientists, because of the advent of quantum theory into physics, discovered in various ways that light could also behave like a particle. This is a little counterintuitive, but it's really where the basis of quantum physics comes from, is that light would make what are called quantum leaps in intensity. Rather than a smooth increase of energy, they would go from a certain amount of energy to a higher level in one big leap. And in the process, they would end up behaving more like particles than like waves. So someone, I don't know who, somebody probably knows who, but what if we take this particle-like nature of light and send it through the double slit? So if you can imagine the particles of light, which are known as photons, being like, individual particles, independent little entities, you can imagine that if you sent them through the double slit one at a time, that the photon would go either through the left slit or the right slit, and it would keep on going and hit the detector dead on opposite the slit. And what you would expect the detector to build up over time is two really bright bands where the photons came through the slits and hit the detector, and then everything else would be dark, right? Because they're behaving like particles. So they set up experiments like this, and in order to send one photon at a time through this experiment, it required quite a long time. And so they would typically set it up and go away and come back the next morning and look at the detector. So confidently expecting that when they came back in the morning, they would see these two bright bands of impact on the detector from all these individual photons hitting the detector. Instead, they saw an interference pattern. They saw the same basic pattern that they saw when they just shone light through that wasn't in its photon form to begin with. So this really got a lot of head scratching, as you can imagine. How can a single photon, remember it's a single photon, goes through this slit, and somehow that single photon interferes with itself like waves on a pond? And they came up with all sorts of possible explanations for it, that it could go in one slit and come out the other and go back in the other one again. And they just kept kind of reaching for explanations for why it would be so. And they couldn't really come up with anything definitive until somebody came up with a way of measuring which slit a photon went through. So they thought if they could put it like a counter on the outside of the experiment, if you will, that doesn't interfere with the trajectory of the photon, but it just lets the experimenter know that this photon went through the right slit or through the left slit. So they, takes a lot of time to develop these kind of test apparatuses in order to make sure you don't have any unintended influence on what you're experimenting with. But they finally got to the point where they were satisfied that they had a way of measuring the photons going through the slits without affecting the photons. And then they turned it on, went away, came back the next morning. And the pattern they saw was the pattern they had originally expected to see, which was two bright bands of impact, and then everything else black. And the only thing, and this experiment has been repeated thousands upon thousands of times, the only difference between the way it's set up that gives you, of sending one photon at a time through the slits, that gives you the interference pattern. And the way it's set up, that gives you the two vertical bands of impact, is that it's observed.
Yeah.
It's measured. So this has become a conundrum that many physicists hate because it suggests, without ever having been proven otherwise, that you have to have an intelligent observer in order for matter to behave as matter. Otherwise, it will behave as energy. So
Can
you
you
can't
see-
really see it from this, Gloria. I'm assuming you added
Yeah.
this screen for us. It's distracting me now. Can you
Oh, okay. Sorry.
bring me back to the
Okay.
other view?
Okay. Sorry. I thought it might be easier for people to
I
have.
forgot you could have done that. It would have been easier to explain it probably, but now that I've explained it,
Yeah.
we can come back to the meat of it. And the meat of it is that no matter how many different ways it's been questioned, an intelligent observer is required for the energy that is matter to behave like matter. Otherwise, the energy that is matter behaves like waves.
Mhm.
But this confounding discovery of science, is at the heart of some of the most consequential and essential scientific findings of physics, and has enabled many of the modern miracles that we take for granted in communication and other fields. So science itself, all this is to get us to the point where science itself, hard science itself, if you want, also has a component that suggests strongly that there's something more, that there is a conscious impact that people have on matter. And that is kind of the knocking the pins out from underneath scientific materialism. Now, most scientists don't spend any time thinking about this because 99.9999% of all scientific research and scientific work is not affected by this peculiar reality of the intelligent observer, that they can make things work. They went out and invented things. They transformed the 20th century and they transformed the world. And so scientists are justifiably proud of all that science has accomplished in that way. But what I find unfortunate is that the conclusion is that that is just a bizarre artifact. The observer effect is just a bizarre artifact of the experiment that one day we'll understand really isn't what it appears to be, and that they ignore it and roll on and ignore any and all other scientific experiments that suggest consciousness, some sort of subtle something exists that is part of that bigger of an equation of how the world and the world of matter work.
Right. So the idea is that everything is kind of potential, like a wave, until it's observed by an intelligent observer, at which point it collapses into what looks like matter, a particle. The wave
Exactly.
collapses into a particle, and that's what we see as matter, which is actually just an accumulation of what points, or I don't know, like on a TV screen, we see an image and we know that it's all dots, right? So,
Yes.
though we look at the image and it looks like an image and we don't question that it's an image, we also know that it's made up of dots. And it's kind of the same principle with all of matter, in a sense.
Yes.
That
No, it's very
projection.
true that matter is quantized. It exists in discrete pieces rather than as a continuous material, an unbroken, seamless material. It actually arranges itself in little tiny pieces, where when it behaves like energy, then it behaves like one continuous whole. So the world around us, when we observe it, behaves like matter. It's what we are accustomed to seeing and experiencing. And it's only in really rare situations, like these kind of highly controlled double slit experiments, where they can see that matter will stop behaving like matter and behave like energy. But for all intents and purposes, what we experience through the senses looks like one continuous whole, when, again, science on a deeper level is telling us it's not, that it's a pontillist painting, it's a pontillist illusion. So
And yet,
one of the kind of debates that physics went through after the notion of the observer effect became more widely discussed, and the duality of matter being able to behave like matter or behave like energy became widely accepted, is the question came up, well, why does it behave not only like matter when I observe it, but why does it behave like a chair rather than a table or a cloud or my left foot? Why does matter take on a particular and specific form, atom by atom? And there was a lot of conjecture that it's random, that it's sort of the last observer determines the nature of reality, and that there are some theories that the entire universe was built up by random observations to what it is today. Now, this is a little hard to take in because there weren't observers, as we understand, at the beginning of time. So who was there doing the observing? The whole reality is a random accident is pretty hard to support. But there are a lot of scientists who like to believe it because it's preferable to believe the corollary, which is that if it's not random, then there is some information that's hidden from scientists that's determining what that form is going to be. And Einstein liked this direction, but he could never find any mathematical proof that there was this, what's called hidden properties inherent in this. Even in its wave-like form, it had inherent properties of what it was going to be when it was observed. There was no way to prove it. And so Einstein went to his grave thinking that there was a big hole in quantum physics because of this random nature. And this is where the famous quote comes from, that he didn't believe God would play dice, that the entire universe would just be this bizarre accident. So along came another physicist named David Bohm, and he built on the work of yet another physicist who had come before him named de Broglie. I think I'm pronouncing that right, who suggested that the information that determines what that waveform is going to turn into once it's observed exists beyond the physical universe. And this is
Enter
hard to-
non-locality.
Say that again.
Enter non-locality.
Enter non-locality. So non-locality is a concept that is wound through pretty much all disciplines of physics, but especially quantum physics. And non-locality is this concept that when matter is behaving as energy, it doesn't exist in the physical universe. It exists in another dimension that is, and this is where your mind will really begin to hurt. That is another realm, let's say. Forget I said another dimension. It exists in another realm that is two-dimensional. And that our realm, the physical universe, is three-dimensional. And Bohm very much championed this concept based on the mathematics and the laws of holograms. Now, holograms were already known and used and created in Bohm's time. But the basic principles of holography is that you can have a three-dimensional image arise from two-dimensional information. So if you think of the hologram as the film and the holographic projection as the image you see, the three-dimensional image, that is the way holography works. Is the film is flat, if you will. It doesn't have more than two dimensions. It's kind of impossible for something to have no depth in the physical world. It's got to be in some sort of medium that has depth. But in principle, it's not required. It's just not feasible to create such film in the physical world. But all you need is two dimensions in mathematical information to define what a three-dimensional image would look like when you shine coherent light through the hologram. So Bohm took this and ran with it and said, this principle could explain why the information that determines what form matter is going to take when it's observed, this could determine why it exists outside of our realm, because it has to be in a two-dimensional form. And that it's only when it's observed that it takes on three-dimensionality. And he referred to this as the, sorry, I'm blanking, two different states. It'll come back to me in a minute. But this notion of the holographic principle was a major contribution of Bohm. But then along came another branch of physics, string theory, for which it fit really well. And today, the most accepted discipline within string theory is M theory. So hopefully I'm not losing you all. I don't see anybody falling asleep yet, but there are a number of people not showing their faces. So M theory posits that there is structure to this non-local realm. This two-dimensional realm is actually made up of layers of energy, or what they're called brains. And each brain has a different energy density. And these energy densities sort of stack on one another. Very difficult to describe two-dimensional reality without resorting to three-dimensional analogies. But
and that's brain, B-R-A-N-E, short for membrane.
Correct. Thank you for that. So M theory suggests that this non-local reality from which the information comes is not just a small part of reality, but the vast bulk of reality. That most of the energy required to eventually end up being able to create a universe, a physical three-dimensional universe, has to exist in this non-local realm, and that non-local realm theoretically can produce unlimited numbers of physical universes, like bubbles in a cosmic ocean of energy. Now, for those of you who have a good understanding of spiritual teachings, especially universal spiritual teachings, you might already begin to see that what M theory is describing as an ocean of energy out of which all creation springs sounds a lot like the astral regions or the spirit regions or the heavens. And without meaning to, I'm sure, M theory actually gave us a location for the afterlife, gave us a location for the heavens. In the brain-like layer structure of M theory, you have a great correlation to the multi-layered traditions of heaven in all religious traditions. The Christians have a highest heaven, a third heaven. The Buddhists have 10 or 25, depending on the tradition. The Hindus have 7, but they all have this notion, not only that there are layers, but that the lowest layers are, if you will, closest to the earth, and therefore the least subtle, and therefore the least spiritual. And that as the layers build, if you will, above that lowest layer next to physical creation, the energy gets finer and the consciousness gets finer. And so there's like a scale of vibration that goes up and up and up and up to higher and finer levels of vibration, the higher you go up through these heavenly realms. So you get this scientific correlation of high frequency energies getting higher and higher in the layers, correlating with finer and finer, more and more subtle, more and more spiritual levels of heaven. And near-death experiencers often talk about how they arrived at a certain expression of the heavens, but that they were aware, or they were told, often they're just aware, that there are levels below them where the consciousness gets worse and worse, and that there are levels above them where the consciousness gets more and more exalted. And yet they end up coming into the heavens at a particular point. And many of them just say, this was my comfort zone. This was the level of vibration at which I could be comfortable. And that when they asked for the tour, I'm looking forward to my tour, by the way. When they ask for the tour of the heavens and they want to go higher, they often have to have like another being encompass them and take them up, because if they weren't encompassed and protected, it would be extremely uncomfortable for them. And it could, essentially be like painful for them to try to exist at this much more rarefied level of vibration. And the same is true the lower they go, that it becomes more and more uncomfortable. And that when we die, we'll go to a region where that is the only vibration, where we can feel completely at home. And it's not this mixture of vibrations that we find on Earth. So this was an exciting correlation for me. I wasn't by no means the first person coming across this to recognize this connection, but I just loved it. And then you have, as I had already referred to, the holographic principle, which also very much fits spiritual teachings of the notion that the physical earth is a kind of a denser manifestation of the first layer of the heavens. There's a Hermetic principle of as above, so below. The manifestation is done in layers, and that this suggests that the highest layers are manifesting the one below it, and the one below it is manifested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until you get to this last level of three-dimensional manifestation from that layer. So,
and at the same time, that lowest layer that is the pattern for our universe, right, our Earth, also interpenetrates. It isn't just somewhere else projecting, it's also very much present right here.
yes.
Right?
Yes. And this, if your head isn't hurting already, this will probably do it. That because all of this vast realm of two-dimensional energy is two-dimensional, there is no space.
And
There
no
is no
time.
distance.
And no
And therefore, its proximity to three-dimensionality has no distance. It interpenetrates the three-dimensional realm at every point. And this is part of the reason why we can have visions of beings kind of coming into physical manifestation, as it's described by Yogananda, whose teachings I rely on the most. He said that beings can vibrate more densely and appear to us, and that ghosts who are kind of stuck betwixt and between, they want to be here, they don't want to be here, they don't have a body, but they wish they had a body, can learn to vibrate more densely and appear and be seen by others. And that this fascinated me perhaps the most in the autobiography of a yogi, which I highly recommend. There is a chapter called The Resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. And Sri Yukteswar describes the heavens. And one of the things that he says about the heavens is that it contains fairies and mermaids and astral creatures who can, if you're, as he put it, pure-minded children can often see these creatures because they have not completely sort of locked their awareness into sensory awareness yet. And that it's all very interpenetrating, interconnected, interwoven, these realities.
Mhm.
So science goes a long way to support some of the most subtle and important spiritual teachings that I know.
When I first learned about non-locality, this other dimension, right, and some of the properties, it explained to me my experience with distance healing. Because I think in distance healing, what we do is we tune into a level or a frequency where there is no space, there is no time. So we're not sending energy to the person. The person could be across the world.
Right.
We're not sending the energy. We're just connecting on that non-local level. And so the effect can be instantaneous, and that it is not affected, and the energy is not diminished by space.
There is no distance in distance healing.
There is no distance. Exactly.
So
And so that was very exciting to me to get the scientific explanation for what I was already experiencing in distance healing.
Right. Well, there's
Yeah.
another big implication, which you very much pointed me toward. Very big implication in this notion of there being a subtle realm and the physical realm is that we simultaneously inhabit both.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That we're not just a physical body for a while and then that goes away and we become a energy body again. We always are the energy body. The energy body, just as that lowest layer of the heavens manifests the physical universe, the lowest level of our astral body manifests our physical body in the same way. The same holographic principle, as it were, is at work. So we are literally manifesting our physical body all the time. We are continuously manifesting our physical body. Now, we don't know that we're doing that. And even knowing it, it's not easy to gain the ability to do it deliberately and consciously. But it is inherent to our nature that our higher levels of being, which include thought, emotion, memories, intention, all those things don't exist in our physical body. They influence the physical body, but we actually experience them in our astral body. So if I have a strong emotion right this instant, I feel the sensation within me, but I don't literally feel it in the physical body. There isn't an emotion organ that is stimulated by it. The entire body is affected by it eventually, but it doesn't originate in the physical body. It originates in your energy body. So that's why when we die and we drop the physical body, and as is described by the near-death experiencers, we're very much like we are now. And in fact, a common story told by near-death experiencers is they don't realize they're dead for a while because everything is so familiar. They have an astral body, an energy body that resembles their physical body. They have the same feelings. They have the same ability to think. They have the same sense of being who they were and who they are. So that is really more who we are always than our physical body is. And what it also means is that there's no distance between the important aspects of us, our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, between any of us. So when I have an emotion, it affects any of you instantly and vice versa, because there's no distance.
We're just not aware.
Say that again.
We're just not aware because we have been conditioned to rely on our physical senses, on our five senses, to tell us what is real and what is not real, and what is going on and what is not going on. And that brings us to the part of your book where you talk about the neurological circuits in the brain and how they're produced and how they influence our thoughts and emotions and behavior until we mature enough to change them through neuroplasticity, meditation, determination, right? So maybe talk a little bit about that.
So I covered this ground in the last time I was with you guys, but I get to come at it from a different direction because I've laid sort of the physics foundation, and now I can talk about neuroscience in connection to that. So we are spiritual beings. We are eternal spiritual beings with multiple bodies. And the physical body that we're born into has a brain. And that brain is pre-configured to keep the physical body functioning properly. It regulates its circulation, it manages the digestion, it makes sure that our respiratory processes are getting enough oxygen into the body and carbon out of it. And all of these things happen without us having any conscious awareness. Now, there's some of them, only one realistically, which is breathing, that we can consciously override. But otherwise, they are an entirely separate nervous system as far as our ability to exert any control. And then we have this other nervous system, the voluntary nervous system, which is also regulated from the brain, that essentially has a nerve that connects to every muscle. And it has nerves from every sensory organ that connects to the brain. So we're fully wired. We have information that can go out to the body from our voluntary nervous system. And we have nerves that send information from the senses back into the brain. And from our infancy, we start to create circuits to do all of the things that those circuits allow us to do, but in shortcuts. So when we're infants and we're lying on our backs, we're just like wiggling our hands and making funny noises and blowing bubbles, right? I mean, we really don't have any control over the body. So for the next years, we go about learning to walk, learning to grasp things, learning to move our body. And as we do so, we repeat those behaviors over and over again. And in doing that, the brain recognizes this is a pattern of movement that we want to do all the time. So when we walk, which we take for granted, when I shake my head, right? I take this for granted. There are thousands upon thousands of neurons that have to fire to allow me to shake my head. They have to fire just the right muscles, and not just like a big giant muscle that's 6 inches long, but individual muscle cells have to be fired that will support that movement of my head. And so we develop these really complex, rich circuits that fire on command, not just one neuron, but that neuron fires others, which fire others, which result in us moving, talking, eating, etc. And it's pretty amazing. This brain can do this because it's obligingly helping us do what we're deciding to do. Now, all that is good and essential. If we didn't have those circuits, we would be unable to really function. If every morning we woke up, even if we had the memories of what we could do, we wouldn't have the circuits of what we could do that would allow us to tie our shoes, to brush our teeth, to function in this world. So it's absolutely necessary that we build these. But then we also start to build other circuits. And these are circuits that automatically fire in response to emotions that we have, or to thoughts that we have, or to the beginnings of behaviors that we have. By behaviors, I mean, now I'm going to talk. Now I'm going to, interact with a person in a way that I normally do. Those are initially also quite helpful. But over time, we might create a lot of circuits that later we wish we didn't have. When we're young, we don't care. We don't know, for the most part, what the long-term consequences of being an angry person is going to be. It can feel empowering when you're a teenager, and it can feel natural when you're a teenager.
It can be a survival mechanism.
They're they're like an emotional survival mechanism, if you will, but they're also a choice. I mean, not every teenager is an angry teenager. Not everyone develops the same circuits to support the same kind of emotions. Children that are fortunate to be raised with more awareness of themselves can, in fact, start creating circuits that support harmonious emotions and positive thoughts from a much earlier age. But most of us are confronted with who we have become, right, in our 20s or so. There's an old saying that when you're 20, you have the face you were born with. But by the time you reach 40, you have the face you deserve. Mm-hmm. That all of life has a bearing, has a wearing on the physical body. And if it's a positive effect, then the face you have at 40 is a healthy, positive, open, smiling, happy. So those negative emotions and negative convictions that we develop in our teens and 20s will really shape our life for as long as we allow it to. In the way that it's essential that your physical body have these supports to do things, your brain works in the same way for your emotions. It tends to stimulate, even though it's in your astral experience, it's in your subtle body that you're experiencing it, it can still be stimulated by the brain circuit firing. And so at some point in our lives, certainly I reached that point in my early 20s, I realized that there were things that I did habitually. And by that, I mean ways in which I experienced emotions and interacted with other people and the kind of convictions I had that I really didn't like anymore. They weren't serving me. If they ever had served me, they don't serve me anymore. And so I needed to set out and figure out, how do I change? And pretty much all of us, when we reach that point, will discover that change is not easy, that we've invested a lot of neurons in the behavior that has become habitual. And that makes it a challenge. But we still have the same principle that we can use deliberately, which is that if we consciously and deliberately practice behaviors and tap into harmonious emotions and affirm and believe positive mental trains of thought, that the brain will obligingly build circuits to support them. And that's why meditation, affirmation, connecting to spirit in some way or another, all work together to rewire your brain and to give you new circuits. Now, it's not that the old circuits are taken away, they're just sort of de-energized. And that the new circuits that you are creating and enjoying more are the ones you naturally yearn to experience. And when you initiate that experience, it is supported by the brain. And that rewiring is, in many ways, what I think the entire adult spiritual life is about. It's about establishing new ways of experiencing emotion and thought, and developing the behaviors that will support that, the key behavior being meditation. So when we meditate regularly, it gets easier and easier to meditate. When we feel joy in meditation, it gets more and more easy to experience that when we're not in meditation. When we read uplifting books that speak to the higher aspects of ourselves, it's much easier to have the conviction of that truth as you go through into your life. And you're building a foundation of behaviors, thoughts, feelings, and memories that make you feel good, that make you feel connected, that literally are connected to your higher self. So the brain's your worst enemy and your best friend. If you program it in a way that is going to lead you into bad diet, bad decisions, negative emotions, you're gonna create a hard life for yourself. But you can also have it be your best friend. 50 years on of meditating, it is, excuse me. Hold on one moment.
While you're pausing a second, I can interject something that I think that meditation can make us aware of patterns that need to change, as well as help us to change it.
Yes.
When I was in my early 20s, I lived in a yoga ashram for 2.5 years, and people would come and join the community, to be a student of our teacher, whose name was Rudy. And after a couple of months of being there, sometimes they would go to him and they would say, before I came here, I was reasonably happy, but now I don't even like myself. I'm seeing all these things that I don't like about myself. And I don't know what's going on. I thought this was going to be so blissful, and I was going to learn to meditate. And he would say, those things have always been there. You just, through your meditation, you're developing a mechanism that allows you to see them. You couldn't afford to see them before. Now you have tools that will help you to correct those things. So if you stop meditating now, they'll still be with you. You may not be as aware of them, but they'll still be there. If you continue, you will come out the other side, because you will have the tools to correct them, and the meditations will help you do that. And I noticed that the ones who did stay and kept meditating for another few months, 6 months, whatever, they were hardly even recognizable at the end of that time. It was amazing, the change in them. Yeah. So
it's a very real thing. It just takes more time than you would think. You have some good experiences in meditation, and it's tempting to think, I got it now. I'm transformed. I'm a spiritual person now because I had these experiences. And you certainly need to have those experiences to become fully transformed, but just a few is not enough, because what you're dealing with are actual physical structures in your brain that you created unwittingly, almost all of us, that easily plunge us into negative experiences. So it takes weeks to months for a new circuit to be formed. Now, the good news is that it probably took months to years for the older circuits to form because you didn't do them very deliberately. You just kind of randomly made your way to being that kind of person, right? But when you're deliberate, you can create those circuits faster. And the other thing that Gloria touched on, which I really want to stress above all, really, about self-transformation and rewiring the brain, is that when you tap into spirit, your efforts are supercharged. It's not just the laborious process of getting, I'm turning this neuron this way, and then I'm going to turn this neuron that way. What you're doing is you're introducing a flow of energy into your being that just kind of pulls the neurons in the new direction that you want them to go, that you get a tremendous boost by communing with spirit, and that your new circuits form much more quickly. And as long as you stay with it, they'll just continue to become stronger and stronger. And as I was going to say before I almost coughed, is that after 50 years of meditating, it is almost impossible for me not to meditate first thing in the morning. It is such a strong habit that I will do it and love it. I appreciate how valuable that is to me. But even when I'm in a not great mood, or I'm tired, or I'm cranky, or I'm sore, or whatever, I'll still meditate, because that has now become a really strong physical structure in my brain that is helping me do the best things for me.
And that's when you need it the most, is when
It's when you need it the most. Yeah.
Right. So I want to switch a little bit now to talk about this convergence of science and spirituality. People who use scientific materialism as a reason not to accept the findings of quantum physics, such as the observer effect and non-locality and their implications. And even though scientism is as much a religion as religious fundamentalism, right? They see their biases as grounded in science and think religion and spirituality is all about belief in the sense of blind faith, and that transcendent spiritual experiences are hallucinations or emotionally induced imaginary delusions. On the other hand, the mystics and the saints and sages and the near-death experiencers who have direct experiences often can't put, I think pretty much ever, can't put their experience into words. It's very difficult to describe because we don't have language for these sublime experiences. And so this is what I see as, kind of the problem. And but so how so where do we start to try to connect between the two?
Well, people often ask me, why did I write The Physics of God or Break Through the Limits of the Brain? And I have sort of two audiences in mind. And one was, and I'm going to make an assumption here, and hopefully I'm not wrong, but one was that people like you and myself are strengthened in our faith, in our determination to continue on our spiritual path when we get corroboration from science, that it gives just a little bit more foundation to what we're doing. And, I also find it fascinating, but I think people find it fascinating because they really want to see that there is a unity, a fundamental and deep unity between science and religion. So that's probably the main audience that I had in mind when I wrote. But I also had another group in mind, and it's impossible for me when I think of this group not to think of my brother and my father, who I was in a very science-oriented family. As I often joke, dinner table conversations required references that you had to be, very, very clear about any argument you made about anything. And so I gained from that. I feel that, karmically, being born into a family like that grounded my thinking, grounded my reasoning processes, and really taught me how to recognize, plausible arguments for the truth. And so for that, I was grateful. But also over decades, what I noticed is that science blocked my brother and my father from being able to even entertain spiritual reality. And that it just was it was a deal breaker from the start. They couldn't even bring themselves to explore spiritual teachings, to even try to understand them, because in their minds it was just a complete waste of time. Why should I read this book you're recommending to us, Joseph? We already know it's nonsense, and we're a little worried about you. So I saw this with my brother and my father, and it made me sad, because I also knew them well enough to know that they were good people. They were positive. They cared about other people. They were very serviceful, took care of others, and they had so many qualities that if they could just kind of nudge over that edge of disbelief, they could apply them and create a meaningful spiritual life for themselves. So that's the other audience, is some people I think are like right on the edge. And if they hear the right explanation at the right time, it may open them to being able to explore more deeply. Yeah. And if I even reach one person in that category, I will feel very happy. I have actually received emails from people that indicate to me that I've reached one, and in fact, many for whom that, they needed that okay to pursue a spiritual life. So for all of us, I think the biggest thing, I'm a writer, I deal in concepts, and yet I would never sit down at a table full of strangers and start trying to talk them into this viewpoint. It's the most off-putting thing I think you can do, and probably sets the possibility of a spiritual life for that person back by decades. All we can really do is model. Be a good person. Be warm-hearted. Be serviceful. If somebody's genuinely interested, just give them little tidbits about why your spiritual life is important to you and what it does for you. But above all, be a person that they would like to be, or do some things in your life that they would consider to be good. And that's how I think it all basically happens. We've all been benefited by the saints and the sages who modeled it, and others who were moved by that, who modeled it for others, and so forth. And that it'll gradually grow. I believe that we're entering and have been in for a while, an age that is expanding, that we're not in a time of tragedy and the world's going to go to the dogs, but that more and more people are learning directly and experiencing directly that they can tap into spirit. They can feel that connection to God within themselves. And that is liberating.
Yeah, I think that there is an urgency also that might play into this in terms of science accepting, some of these principles that have been proven over and over by quantum physics, because I think the world is experiencing the consequences of scientific materialism, which has given no thought to long-term effects of technologies, as well as being largely funded by military and political forces with their own agenda. I think a lot of scientists would like to investigate these things, but they're afraid of losing their jobs and being blacklisted or whatever. I think that our emotional and moral and spiritual maturity has not kept pace with our left brain tendencies for inventing new devices. And so we often use them destructively and even self-destructively without heeding the global and ecological consequences. And I think that maybe my hope is that the crises that we are facing with climate change and war and shootings and all that will drive, because I think there is more and more of a movement towards spiritual awakening and spiritual awareness at the same time. And I'm just hoping that the urgency will promote, kind of like the Berlin Wall coming down, all of a sudden a shift, so that more and more scientists start, maybe being open to some of these principles.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's kind of inevitable that it will be a transformation that moves through society. An interesting little factoid from a Pew study that was conducted back in 2009 was that 51% of scientists believe in God or a higher power.
Mm-hmm.
So because they're conducting science, because their livelihood is based in some sort of science, doesn't mean that they don't also have inner aspirations for something greater. And that it was only 41% of scientists who made up sort of the hardcore of scientific materialists. I would love to see that same study done again to see whether any of those numbers have shifted since 2008, but I haven't seen it. Mm. But I think it is shifting. I think that the coming of universal spiritual teachings from the East has made it much easier for the scientifically minded to embrace the more subtle concepts of an inner connection to a higher consciousness. Mm-hmm. I think for a lot of people, and you mentioned this at the beginning, for a lot of people, they went away from organized religion because they just couldn't take in all of the dogmas and accept them because they just didn't work rationally. Why should anybody who has not accepted Jesus go to hell? I mean, it's hard, right? Can you? I know many people who that was it. That was the breaking point, because they knew good people everywhere who weren't Christians. So who came up with this notion that they would all go to hell? And that they didn't find a sympathetic response to that within their particular connection to Christianity, and so they just went away from it because it
I
no
think a
longer
lot
added
of
up.
them rightly rejected, the dogmatic approach and the institutional religion, but they didn't look any deeper.
Right.
Yeah, that's the sad part, is that they stopped there, and I want to
There is a big wave of meditation and
yes,
this universal spirituality that's coming to us from the East that is picking up a lot of those people who no longer could embrace a strict religious set of beliefs and dogmas, but could fully an experiential approach.
yeah. Okay, I'd like to open it up now for people, and remember that if you have a comment or a question, please have your video on if you want to ask it out loud, and if you don't want to have your video on, then type it in the chat. And there's something in the chat. The Heart Math Institute has much research on neuroplasticity. Sri Devi mentioned that. Yes, I know. Wonderful stuff that they do there. And Maria was remembering for you David Bohm's implicate and explicate order.
Thank you. Thank you. That
Okay.
circuit just wasn't firing.
Right. So if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment, please do. Just unmute yourself and make sure your video is turned on so that we don't have black spots on our recording, and or just type it in the chat and I'll ask it. Anybody? Oh, I guess.
Hi, Gloria, it's Carol, and
Hi, Carol.
I'm with my sister-in-law, Jean.
Hi, Jean.
And Joseph, I was present at your last presentation with Caritas and really loved your presentation and your ideas and so forth. And I was struck tonight with your thoughts about light and the different behaviors of light. And it reminded me of Yogananda's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, when it talks about how light is coming into manifestation, and how it is transformed into matter, how it really the density and so forth. And I couldn't help thinking that the intelligent observation aspects were related to that consciousness of being our own witnesses, that we're looking to be aware of ourselves. And there's that transcendent quality that is like that develops our own intuitive discrimination that Yogananda also talks about. Does that sound right to you?
Well, definitely. I completely agree that light, the biblical passage, "Let there be light," is a profound teaching of the way in which creation came into being. Yogananda was a little bit more expansive, which was,
right,
to paraphrase, which he didn't actually use this paraphrase, but I have, which is it's "let there be vibration," that he would often refer to the cosmos, not just the physical universe, but also the heavens and subtle realms beyond that, as vibratory creation. And that vibratory energy is found in incredibly subtle, high frequency vibrations as thought, all the way down to very slow vibrations as matter. And that spectrum of the vibratory frequency is what creates these different levels of manifestation. But they're all levels of manifestation, and that we as souls are actually beyond vibration. Our bodies that are enclosing us and through which we operate are made of that vibratory substance. we, like God, are beyond it. So not sure where you were going with how that led to intuition and our connection. Do you want to try me again?
Well, I was thinking that as we observe, as we raise our consciousness to observe ourselves and actually can discriminate between our higher thoughts and lower thoughts and change our behaviors and so forth, that it is acting on a higher vibration.
Yes.
And in bringing light, I guess I'm seeing also bringing light into our minds, actually. I mean, I'm sort of seeing this transcendence of how light, the role of light, spiritually and physically. I mean, there's, it's a powerful manifestation.
Yes. No, I agree. I follow you now. In some ways, you can simplify what we're all trying to do to become more spiritually aware into seeing that we're all trying to raise our vibration. We're trying to raise the frequency at which we vibrate. And that's not physically, especially, but it's more the level of vibration of our thoughts and our feelings. And the higher they are, the better we feel. The higher they are, the more clarity we have mentally and emotionally. So it's in a way we're like riding the light back to source.
Yes.
By embracing that higher and higher vibration. So yes, I completely understand what you mean. And in fact, the universal experience of God is as light.
Yeah.
That you're filled with light, and that it is an extraordinarily uplifting experience.
Yeah.
Alain, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Gloria. When you mentioned the David Bohm, he himself observed that indigenous elders had a much easier way to get into quantum physics than most of his colleagues who are trained in quantum traditional physics. So, and I'm wondering if the kind of education we have developed in the States, I'm from France initially, and it's the same thing, which privilege only the left brain aspect, or mostly, is actually responsible for what we are experiencing now with the what you call the scientific materialism, that we have nurtured people in that domain. And to what extent is now, for instance, quantum physics taught in a way that brings out more of this holistic view of our brain, the fact that we have a left brain and right brain, as the Gilchrist says, that we need to be equally developed. And indigenous people seem to have had a form of education which privileged enough of that, so there's more balance between the two hemispheres. So it's a complex question, but I hope you understand my point.
Well, I think it's fascinating that David Bohm said that, because I think a commonality of indigenous people and the kind of tradition of shamanism is that they honor people who perceive subtle reality.
Yeah. Yes.
And that subtle reality can take all sorts of forms depending on where their particular kind of beliefs and practices lead them. But in those sort of relatively small societies, the shaman is given the highest degree of respect and reverence. And we just don't have that equivalent at all in modern Western societies, that at best, the shamans of today, people who teach meditation or who are priests or ministers, are considered to be generally okay for society, helpful. But the real people making the real decisions are, as you say, the ones who are operating from the left brain and really don't like the right brain. The right brain's kind of scary. All this feeling and intuition and love and
Right.
messy stuff. So it's very unfortunate, but I do think the tide is turning. I do think that there is more of an acknowledgement of the need for people to be more balanced in their lives, that work-life balance became a concept, I'm not sure when, 20, 30 years ago, perhaps. But it hasn't gone away. It's still a concept that is put out there, and corporations bring in people like myself and others who can talk to people about work-life balance and the need for that. So as society elevates the importance of it, it will have more traction. And I think society is doing that. But it's slow.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a paragraph in your book where it talks about, you say, material science is methodical and precise, but can only confirm the truth of one detail at a time. It's unable to see the whole. The science of religion is methodical but less precise, and yet able to see the whole. Together, the science of religion guiding the way, material science painstakingly confirming, science and religion give us the fullest picture of reality. And so when I read that, I was thinking, yes, like, Ian McGilchrist talks about the left brain and the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere in his book, The Master and His Emissaries, and in his newer book also, that material science is like the left brain, methodical and precise, but doesn't see the whole picture, right? And can't grasp the science of religion, as you put it, which I think of as, yeah.
And perhaps even more ironically, the meticulous and precise march of science takes human experience out of reality and places it into a messy subjectivity that, the more hardcore thinkers in terms of scientific materialism look forward to the day when everyone is rational and that there are no feelings, messing things up. Yeah. I can understand the desire, because a lot of the feelings that are messing things up are, to my mind, very destructive in our world. But you would throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, if you cut people off from being able to have feelings, because ultimately it's our feelings that give most meaning and purpose to who we are and what we do, and life satisfaction. Just pure mental, perception is never going to be that satisfying.
Right. Deborah, you have your hand up.
I guess I've got several questions here. One is, I love the discussion you had on light and all of that I do think, but I also think, like, as an engineer and you as having that physics background too, that the spiritual light and the divine light to me is different than the electromagnetic light. And so my training put me to always think about electromagnetic light, but divine light is different to me. It feels different, and we bring that in. I think it mixes with the photons and does that. And I guess I think too, when you mention the astral plane as being on kind of that other level that's different than our physical, that some of these ideas of light also penetrate through the different layers as well, that we're not, and so I'm always trying to be cautious on defining the two. But then the astral, you mentioned the emotions too, and Gloria just mentioned some of these emotions. And I have a meditation I learned, it's like Chinese medicine, that the emotions are stored in the organs. And there's a new guy talking about actually making the connections as he works with visceral manipulation and the brain, that they are connected and the emotions are related. And then what was the other one? Was like, I'm looking at quantum biology too. And if you have any thoughts of the quantum physics going into biology is actually showing more of the weirdness of quantum biologists. Biologists are a little, squishier than physicists sometimes in listening to them, because it's this wet, material that they deal with. So there's just a bunch of kind of different questions to take your pick.
Well, let me start with the electromagnetic spectrum. The way I would describe it is that the electromagnetic spectrum is defined by the fact that it can be measured by instruments that we can build.
Right.
But there is no reason to think that those frequency wavelengths can't get finer and finer and finer and finer.
I like the term finer more than higher.
Yeah, I think that higher can be judgmental.
A different layer, like on an astral plane, and the high astral planes, my experience there was wonderful. It felt like that higher vibe, but it wasn't a higher frequency of electromagnetism, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So,
but if tends to be proves to be true, what I think it strongly suggests is that there are vibrating energies that exist, that surround us, that interpenetrate our bodies, that are everywhere,
right,
that are vibrating at a wavelength a billionth of the wavelength of the finest electromagnetic energy.
Yeah. And to me, it feels like a finer, different substance too.
Well, it certainly behave differently,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, that too.
Because electromagnetic energy is radiant. It goes out in all directions, if you will, and it has certain behaviors that have to do with space and distance.
Right.
Because it's operating in a three-dimensional universe, where the energies that we're talking about in the subtler two-dimensional realm, there is no space. So they behave differently. They're more coherent, I think, is how I would describe it.
And that's what they're finding in the biology, is the coherence is the key factor.
Right.
And falling out of coherence. And that's sort of what the meditation on the organs was about. It was creating a coherence within the organ, which then can help the emotions move through the body and mature faster.
Right. And I definitely
so you
think
don't have to be
emotions
stuck
move.
in that anger place. You can let it go, and then actually your whole organs feel better.
Yes.
And
So I had said that your emotions don't originate in the body. I still believe that's true, but they immediately affect the body.
I agree. Yeah.
And so they can get, as you are phrasing it, kind of stuck in specific places, not just generally
Right.
in the body. And that knowing, having somebody who is versed in that kind of healing can really help you localize where emotions are being held and release them with a focus on that locality. And I think that's great.
Exactly.
I think most of ill health is emotions that have not been able to be released through the body.
Mhm.
And they keep resonating in parts of the body, and the body just breaks down.
Yeah.
It can't do its fine control of making extraordinarily large numbers of proteins every second throughout the body in perfect coordination when it's got this sort of gale force wind of emotion working against it. And the body eventually breaks down. But it breaks down very specifically. There are a lot of people like somebody will come up with their name in a minute for me. You Can Heal Your Life.
Oh, Louise
Louise
Hay.
Hay.
Louise Hay was very good at associating particular emotions with particular disease pathologies because they tend to break down the functions, the metabolic functions of particular parts of the body. And that, I think, is in some ways the biggest key to self-healing, is figuring out where you have unreleased, unresolved, usually hidden emotions that keep playing out in your body that you've chosen a long time ago to ignore because they're unpleasant. You don't like them. You don't want them to be a part of you, but they don't go away.
And
And
I think that speaks to what she was saying too about the flow going through. And what did you say? It observing in yourself and using the light to help discriminate within our framework or something.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That can help bring that to our awareness. Mhm.
Yes. And if you just raise your vibration generally by tuning into spirit, it will have a healing effect in and of itself. The more you can have that vibration fill your body, the more healing that is just all by itself.
And I have a comment in the chat from Maria. She says,
I can say it. It's just
Oh,
that I
okay.
needed to write it down because I have so many thoughts going through my head at once.
okay,
So I didn't want to
just
interrupt.
about out of time, so let's make it quick.
All righty. So the first one was a comment. And my question was, when the two persons were in the Faraday cages, is the claim that one of them was able to like sense the light as a consequence of having done the meditation? Or is it that those two individuals are spiritually at the same wavelength and therefore on an astral plane, they're all one, although we're all one, period. But we're making the claim that other people who didn't meditate weren't able to co-register the light. So my question was, is it because they're at the same wavelength? And you were talking about the different levels that you mentioned, the Buddhist 1025 and Hindu 7. Anyway, I just had this question about collective consciousness and the being able to communicate because we're at the same wavelength.
Well, I think it speaks to all of those things. I think, yes to all of the above. The people who conducted the experiment were being, meticulous and precise and proving one point at a time. And the only point that they were able to prove was that the EEG wavelengths that were recorded correlated. That's all they could say. And I can say, and you can say what that might mean, but as scientists, they weren't trying to make a case for any particular manifestation of consciousness or any other way in which that relationship could have occurred. They could just say it occurred.
Okay, I think I'm going to go to my last one. Have you studied Bucky Fuller's ideas of tensegrity, and his ideas of self-interference and the vector equilibrium?
Tensegrity, yes. The other, no. Although I love Buckminster Fuller's life story. I find him absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And an amazing font of genius level ideas that we're going to be catching up with for another 100 years, probably. I read a story about him. This is nothing to do with tensegrity or any of his other concepts, but he was devoted to his wife.
Hmm.
And the story that I read was that she was very ill and he was taking care of her. And he just told her that if she died, he was going to go with her.
Hmm.
And I don't know to what degree, she believed it or what. I mean, they were very close. And she died, and he died the next day.
Hmm.
So sweet, bittersweet story, but our convictions and our emotions are far more powerful than we tend to think.
Yeah. And I liked his quote, which I hope I can remember and not have to paraphrase, where he said, nothing changes by resisting the existing model. To change things, you have to create a new model that makes the existing model obsolete.
Yeah.
I hope with the help of your book and your work and others like it, trying to bring together science and spirituality, that we can create this new model, and the old model of separation and conflict will become obsolete. And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much, Joseph, for joining us this evening, and thanks to all of you who attended as well. And I hope to bring you back sometime to talk about the Yugas.
Be my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank
See
you
next
so much.
time.
Gloria.